Hey guys, what is up? It is expansion day, and I have spent the better part of the last week theory crafting a bunch of new decks for you guys to play in the new Guardians of the Ancient expansion. As you guys have seen in the title, I have built 10 new decks using the new cards. Some of these are going to be more experimental, and some of them are going to come off the gate as pretty competitive, and I will talk about which are which. But if you want to check out any of these decks for yourself, you can head over to the site. It's going to be in the pinned comment. And I also have spent the last day updating every single deck on my website. So whether you want to try out one of the new decks that I built, or whether you just want an updated version of an old list, you can head here, pinned comment, for the import code. I won't be going over all of the individual changes to these decks in this video, but in 2 days from now, I will put out a sort of like a new series that I plan on doing, which is a sort of like a weekly meta report. And in that video, I will definitely be talking a little bit more in depth about some of the broader meta shifts and these individual changes. So watch out for that. All right, deck number 1, Aurelia Azir. This personally is the deck that I am most excited for in the expansion, and I wanted to start this video off with a bang. If you've watched me play the preview of the expansion, or if you've heard me talk about this deck, you know that I love this deck. This is definitely the best way to use Aurelia. It might be the best way to use Azir, although it'll be fairly close to Lucian Azir. I think this ends up being a bit stronger overall, and it is just really degenerate. I love this. Basically, the idea is pretty simple. If you haven't seen this, you are playing Azir and playing Emperor's Dais, swarming the board every time you do an attack, and every single time you trigger a Blade Dance off of Aurelia or any of her support cards, you are summoning all of your Sand Soldiers, and this will happen sometimes like 4 or 5 times a turn. It is truly absurd. Now, don't get me wrong, for now, this will definitely be more of a tier 2 deck than a tier 1 deck. As crazy as it is, especially if you've seen some of these games, it does have some like crazy bursts, but it is a somewhat counterable strategy, and the like top tier decks are built in a way to counter some of these kinds of strategies. So it's not going to be super nuts at every rank, but it's still a very competitive deck, and yeah, when it works, it's absolutely nuts. This is the deck that I'm going to be playing on, day 1 of the expansion. In fact, if you're watching this video, there's a pretty good chance I'm playing this deck right now on my stream on twitch.tv/swimstream. And yeah, I will be updating it as I go. It's a really fun deck. If you want to play this deck, some quick tips that are going to be pretty important. Mostly think of this as a combo deck more so than an aggro deck. For the most part, you want to be mulliganing hard for Emperor's Dais and Azir. You don't want to keep cards like Aurelia in your opening hand. The Blade Dance is something that you want to come later. You just want to set up your Azir and your Emperor's Dais and then do a big combo turn on like turn 5, 6, or 7 that will effectively just end the game on the spot. Getting in chip damage before that is nice, and there's a lot of ways to do that, but for the most part, save your Ribbon Dancer until like turn 6 or 7, usually after Inspiring Marshal, and chain it with some of the recalls like Navori Conspirator or Lead and Follow to reuse the Ribbon Dancer, and this is after you've played the Dais and the Azir, and that will just end the game on the spot at that point. It's pretty silly. New deck number 2, and I should mention, these are in no particular order. Daybreak Stunlock. This is actually a pretty cool deck. It's using the, Daybreak mechanic. We haven't really had the ability to have a full Daybreak deck yet. Leona has seen some play, but mostly within, like ASOL decks or decks where she's not really ran to level up, and you're just using her as like an efficient stun in some metas where you want a 4-3-5 stun. But now that we've got Solari's Sunhawk, it actually might be a relevant enough tool to potentially push this deck over the edge. Basically, think of this like a very tempo-driven deck where you're going to want to curve out your units and just like trigger enough Daybreaks to eventually, level your Leona and win the game off of that. Ravoon is very important to the functioning of this deck because, of course, the only way to like really close the game out reliably, unless your opponent's just not on a great hand, is to have Ravoon and Leona, and then if you just play a couple of Daybreaks, you'll stun the entire board and you should be able to close the game out pretty easily after that. This deck also runs the Lucian Senna package, which works really well for Daybreaks for a couple of reasons. They fill a few of the missing gaps, like Daybreaks don't really have a 3-drop, and Zenith Blade as a 2-of is actually really tight in this deck, and on occasion, you'll be able to give Overwhelm to a double attack Lucian or Senna for a different way to win the game. Normally, this deck wants to be closing out with Relentless Pursuit, but if you want any tips when playing this deck out, be prepared to keep Ravun in your opening hand in some of the slower matchups if you have some of the earlier plays. Keep in mind, mulliganing isn't just about, kicking expensive things and keeping light things. You often want to be tailoring your mulligan to, the needs of the matchup and the needs of your deck as a whole. And I know a lot of people are going to be asking why we're not running the new Daybreak card, Eye of the Rahorek, in this deck, and the short answer is Eye of the Rahorek is basically just too slow for the speed this deck wants to play at. This is a good card for stalling out, and it is in another one of my decks in this video, but for a Daybreak deck that's playing for the Daybreak synergy card, you do not want to run Eye of the Rahorek, really. All right, deck number 3, Kyrian Burn. This is actually a pretty cool concept. This is built off of a version put together by Floppy Mudkip, who you might know from the seasonals, but basically the idea behind this deck is we're using this new card, Kyrian Sunworker, and we're cloning it. This is a card you want to run in with Shadow Isles more than anywhere else, and that's because Shadow Isles has access to Stalking Shadows, as well as even Fading Memories, which can help sometimes. So if you're getting Kyrian Sunworker off of Stalking Shadows, you need to play the Ephemeral one before the non-Ephemeral one. That way the Ephemeral one will be obliterated, and the non-Ephemeral one will transform instead of dying to his own Ephemeral. And basically, you are just burning the Nexus out through the combination of Elusives as well as Burn, basically just Nexus damage. We're even running one Funsmith, which isn't actually that bad in this list. When you look at it, it will actually deal a pretty crazy amount of damage, and it accelerates a lot of finishers while even letting you reach some of your tools and start slowing down the game with some. There's a lot of games where you can actually play a Funsmith and start Mystic Shouting for 3 damage against important targets that your opponent has to keep alive. Normally, this deck plays as the aggressor, but like any PNZ burn style list, you do have a little bit of inherent flexibility. There will be weird games where you do use some of your cards to control the board. For the most part, if you like nut drawing, crazy combos, and killing your opponent very fast, this is definitely the deck for you. There's a lot of ways that this deck does it, but being able to get the Sumpworks posses is something that this deck will do pretty quickly and pretty reliably. I think surprisingly so, because all you need to do is get Kyrian Sumpworker plus Iterative, or off of Stalking Shadows, or plus Fading Memories if you're okay with it happening in the late game. Usually this isn't a card you want to be playing on like turn 2 or 3, but you will be getting Posse on, turn 4 in most games, sometimes as early as turn 3, and when that happens, it can be pretty disgusting. The real hidden gem of this deck is Stygian Onlooker. Because we are a burn deck, we really need to get their health down early without committing much to the board, and you should be looking out for early spots where you can sometimes get like a Stalking Shadows into Onlooker or a Fading Memories chain off of Onlooker, and on turn 3 or 4, sometimes you can just be attacking with like 3 Stygian Onlookers for 12 damage. Definitely don't miss one of those opportunities, because that's a lot of how this deck can win games. All right, new deck number 4, Zilean Go Hard. So I think this is probably the best kind of deck to be running Zilean in. A lot of people have been asking me, how do you build Zilean? How do you play around Zilean? Well, in this case, Go Hard is pretty great for him. Go Hard in particular allows you to just kind of like play a lot of cheap cards that slow down the game, and they give you value to your predicts, right? Because you're building around these predict cards, less Pyron Chronomancer, Scrying Sands, etc., because you're running Zilean and you're trying to get some time bombs, and you're also predicting into Go Hards. So it allows your predicts to find either Zilean or Go Hard as ways of, getting payoff, which is pretty nice, right? Overall, I will say this is probably not going to end up being a super competitive deck. The more I look at it, the more Zilean is going to be struggling, I think, a bit as a card right now, but it won't be bad. This is definitely going to be, I think, the best way to use Zilean. And there's a few cute tricks you can do with this deck, such as Rite of Culling on your own Zilean to just get another Zilean on turn 3 for 8 bombs, and just chain your draws in terms of tips for this deck. I mean, if you've played a Go Hard deck, it'll be pretty straightforward, but the biggest thing if you haven't played a Go Hard deck is to make sure that you are using your Go Hards before your draws as much as possible. Even if it might feel a little bit weird, even if there might be a situation where you have to save your draw for a little bit later, or if there's a situation where you might have to use Go Hard on a unit where it's like, all right, but not amazing, those are usually worth doing before you draw or before you predict, because keep in mind, predicting is just searching through your deck, and if you can get an opportunity to go hard before you predict, that's usually going to be worth doing in this deck. All right, new deck number 5, Countdown Thralls. Now, I promise this concept is at least a little bit better than it looks. All right, let me back up. So to clarify, I don't expect this deck to be competitive, and this is definitely unrefined. I actually plan on playing this a little bit in the next several days and seeing if I can refine it or seeing if I just want to scrap it. But this sort of deck with Frozen Thrall is something that people tried to build, you know, when Talia came out, when Shurima came out 2 months ago, and it was completely terrible, like the least competitive thing ever. Now, with some of these new tools, it's actually quite a bit better, to the point where I think I would not be surprised if a refined version of this in a couple of weeks was able to stabilize as something like a tier 3 deck. The reason being, these advanced cards, mostly like Time in a Bottle, Clockwork Creator, and even Imagine Impossibilities, can create super scary situations with these Frozen Thralls. There are a lot of slower decks that will basically have no way of dealing with a turn 4 8/8 overwhelm staring them down, right? Like a lot of the slower, more control-y decks will be able to kill it before it ends the game, right? But they'll have to expend a lot of resources into killing your 8/8 overwhelm that you have on turn 4. It'll deal some damage to you, and you will have other ways of being able to close the game out, right? There's just not that many efficient tools when you are cheating these out very, very early, to the point where these advanced cards actually do a little bit more than they seem. There's also a lot of cool combos that this deck can do. For example, Stoneweaving is in this deck for a very specific function. You always play Stoneweaving when you have exactly 2 mana left, so that it will always give you a Frozen Thrall, because it will only find you a landmark you can afford if you have exactly 1 unit mana left after casting Stoneweaving, 2 mana before. That means it'll guarantee give you a Frozen Thrall, and that's really powerful, because in this deck you will take this 2 mana Frozen Thrall every single time, as it's largely the entire point of your game plan. You just clone Thralls until you win the game off of it. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, this deck definitely goes into the experimental category. I do not expect this to be close to competitive right off the bat, but I think it might surprise us in the coming weeks or months, at least a little bit. All right, deck number 6, Fiora Shurima. Look at this. The spell bar is so long, I actually have to scroll down. I love it. It's a Fiora deck, baby. You guys know how I feel about Fiora decks. So yeah, this is the new form of Fiora. Now that Shurima has a few powerful tools, you can build an all-in Shurima deck around Fiora. This is something that, like with the last deck, I tried to do 2 months ago. Fiora Shurima ended up not working. Shurima didn't really have the tools for this deck, but with this new expansion, Scrying Sands is an insanely important tool Fiora decks needed, because you really, especially when giving up Freljord, you need the ability for this 1 mana, just like -2, that will help keep Fiora alive while putting pressure on something. In addition to that, we also have Soothsayer. This instant resolve 2 mana give Fiora a spell shield while developing a blocker is very, very powerful, and will help this deck be able to beat a lot of the matchups that would normally be trying to control it out. Like with any all-in Fiora list, this list basically builds to get Fiora on turn 3 every single game possible. You play Fiora on turn 3, and then you proceed to lock the opponent out of playing the game with your just arsenal of tools to be able to both keep Fiora alive and kill the opponent things while, you know, leveling your Fiora and using her alternate win con to win the game every time. Basically, the way this is going to work involves very, very reactive play. If you haven't played a Fiora deck before, an all-in Fiora deck, it's going to feel very unnatural. You will be passing a lot. The spacebar button is your friend. You need to play this deck incredibly reactively. Do not spend mana unless you are safe to commit before your opponent, pretty much. You basically want to make them spend their mana first into you, and if they pass back into you, usually you're happy, because you're just collecting resources, unless the pressure's on you to make a move, which it rarely is in the early game. I think it's incredibly important to view all-in Fiora decks as effectively control decks, right? Like, they're winning the game through a different way, but you play them in essence the same way like you would play a Shadow Isles Freljord control. You just like pass and play fully reactively and just counter every single thing your opponent is trying to do. Shutting down their game plan is what allows you to win with yours. All right, deck number 7. This is actually a pretty cool one. For the most part, Shurima aggro, Shurima Noxus aggro, has been a deck a bunch of different times through different versions. People have messed around with Azir versions. You guys might remember when Shurima came out 2 months ago, one of the decks I had early on was an Azir Noxus aggro version. I ended up removing it in favor of Pirate Burn with Gangplank because Shurima was just short of having just the amount of aggro tools necessary to feel comfortable fleshing out an aggro deck. But now, with Merciless Hunter, I think that might be just enough to push Shurima aggro over the edge. And I mean, like, you know, proper aggro with Noxus and everything. In addition, Merciless Hunter is absolutely the card that Renekton was looking for this entire time. But Kai Sandspinner is really awkward with Renekton since they're both on turn 4. Merciless Hunter is a nuts card, and it curves with Renekton beautifully. So I think it might be finally time to go back to trying Renekton in an aggro deck, and Merciless Hunter is really great, not just with Renekton, but as an aggro tool in general. It's just a super efficient card. There's not too much else to say about this deck. I mean, it's aggro. You basically just deal damage to the opponent's Nexus. But I will say, keep in mind, Merciless Hunter is also being ran in Freljord versions of Renekton, which play quite a bit slower. They're not like full aggro. They're more mid-rangey. And Merciless Hunter makes that deck quite a lot better as well. So both of those styles of Renekton decks get quite a bit better off of this. All right, deck number 8. This one, you might notice I'm kind of cheating because LeBlanc Sivir was basically a deck before, but I would say similarly to the last couple of decks, it's a deck that was really tried early on in Shurima, but sort of felt like it got dismissed due to a lack of just like being a couple of tools short. It was always like, you know, a deck that was able to pick up a tier 3 win rate. Well, I shouldn't really say always because it often struggled at that, but it felt fairly close. With a couple of these new tools, however, most importantly, probably Thrashing Snapper, and of course the Merciless Hunter that we talked about before, it might just get there. Now, Thrashing Snapper is a card that I didn't think too much of at first, but in this deck, it's actually pretty good. There is just enough vulnerable in this deck, especially now that we also see Merciless Hunter in the game is kind of the perfect curve for Thrashing Snapper, because Thrashing Snapper really thrives off of vulnerable, right? You want to give something vulnerable with Rockhopper or Merciless Hunter or maybe Exhaust, and your Snapper that you played on turn 1 that the opponent couldn't block for a couple of turns because they didn't want to play Reputation, your Snapper will then turn around on turn 4 or 5 and maybe get a free challenge into some vulnerable thing while triggering, you know, a Reputation proc, which is really, really nice. And again, keep in mind just how big Merciless Hunter is in this deck. LeBlanc Sivir is an archetype that really thrives off of this vulnerable keyword, and that's why they run Rockhopper and Exhaust in most cases, because they have these high attack, quick attack units, and because, you know, we have stuff, especially now that we've got Thrashing Snapper. Vulnerable is a great keyword. We were always a little bit open on this 3-mana slot. Merciless Hunter fits in beautifully yet again here, and LeBlanc Sivir feels like it's well poised to be a high tier 3 deck, maybe even pushing tier 2 depending on where the meta ends up. All right, guys, we're nearing the end of the list with deck number 9, a new version of Targon's Peak. Now, you might have seen Targon's Peak do pretty well in the seasonal tournament this last weekend, and it is getting a couple of new tools. It happens to be a pretty decent archetype in this metagame. Most importantly, Targon's Peak got a lot better with the recent additions of Ice Shard and Blighted Ravine. That helped basically all styles of Freljord decks in the last couple of months. But with the advent of Solari Sunhawk as well, it can be a pretty scary tool for this style of deck, basically just giving it a free ability to, you know, stun some big attacker in the mid to late game for a very, very low mana commitment. Of course, Targon's Peak is a deck that's primarily built around using the card Targon's Peak. You play this card on turn 5, and every turn after that, there's a chance you just win the game on the spot. It's pretty great. But I think a lot of people kind of misattribute this deck to the idea of Targon's Peak, and it should be noted that more often than not, against a lot of like the early tempo driven decks, you're winning the game off of shutting down your opponent's strategy, maybe more so than enabling your own. So I really want you to think of this more as a full control deck. You do need to be passing, you do need to be taking like really, really aggressive passes and gaining reactivity so that you can win with, you know, avalanches and blighted ravines, as well as stuff like Solari Sunhawk, depending on how the opponent plays, right? You will be playing out stuff like Wording Stones and Catalyst of Eons early in a lot of situations, but for the most part, just play reactive and set up your Targon's Peak. when you discount something like a Field Rush on turn 6, you can just win the game on the spot, and sometimes this deck can cheat out Targon's Peak even earlier than that. For example, when you play Spacey Sketcher, you should pretty much always in the early game go for Moonsilver if you can. It's, you know, gets out of your hand for 0 mana, and you can even discount something by 1. It's absolutely amazing. Because Targon's Peak, to be able to maximize its value, the odds of pulling out, you know, discounting your Asol or your Field Rush so you can just win the game super early, you need to vomit out a lot of your cheap cards in your hands to be able to do that, and Spacey Sketcher is a phenomenal card for that, especially when you get Moonsilver off of her, and you can play Targon's Peak on turn 3 or 4 with Moonsilver as well. Lastly, we've got one potentially scary card in Buried in Ice, this new Freljord card that might be able to fit into this deck pretty uniquely for a few reasons. It's sort of like it's sort of comparable to a Ruination style effect because it's 9 mana slow and it can replace the enemies with Frozen Tombs. In this case, we have some pretty nice synergy in the form of It That's Theirs, which is a really great thing because Targon's Peak decks are naturally running It That's Theirs already, so it doesn't have that built-in deck building cost. But in a lot of cases, when you use Buried in Ice and replace the opponent's board with Frozen Tombs, if you follow up next turn with an It That's Theirs and obliterate all landmarks, you are winning the game on the spot. I mean, it might feel kind of bad because you might obliterate your own Targon's Peak when that happens, but it's definitely worth it if you're wiping their entire board off of it and you are going to be winning that game. So it's just a cute combo that's able to use Buried in Ice. I think this card will still be very powerful and very scary in other styles of decks in the future, but there's not too much else Buried in Ice will hit right away. There will come a time where this card will be absolutely toxic in some kind of control deck that, you know, wants this exact effect, or maybe more like a mid-range deck that plays for this exact speed to close out games, but that time might not yet be here. It can see a slot in this deck though. Lastly, obviously Targon's Peak is known for being like a pretty high RNG card, and there's a lot of high rolls with this deck, but keep in mind this is a very high skill ceiling deck to play. You do need to know exactly like how to play the like very reactive control game plan of passing, which most people are extremely uncomfortable with, as well as a lot of interesting decision points you will have to execute in terms of maximizing your odds from Targon's Peak, choosing the right things both to discard and off of Sketcher. There's a lot going on with this list, which is why I have it listed as a hard deck. So, you know, keep in mind it is, you know, a fun meme deck, but for the most part you still do need to be thinking pretty hard about it if you do want to make sure you are maximizing your value. And that brings us to the last and final deck that I made, Yasuo Malphite. So, alright, you guys have been asking me to build a Malphite deck. Malphite is a very, very interesting card that has a lot of kind of like bizarre aspects to it. You need to be able to summon enough landmarks, but landmark decks don't really want to be able to fit in Malphite. You are playing him in Targon, so you need to play a very, very slow strategy that doesn't really play for the board too much while still being able to stay alive. And Yasuo isn't the worst with Malphite. You know, I mean, they're a cool combo in League of Legends, I guess, you know, because in League he goes like, "Hiya," and Malphite's like, "Bam," and you can run them in a deck in this game together, just like in League. Like, look, listen, this deck's not actually good. Don't actually play this deck, but if you had to play a Yasuo Malphite, this is at least a decent version of it. For the most part, Eye of the Rahorek is kind of the glue that gives this a real chance to tie together. You need to draw this card pretty reliably in your games, but if you have Eye of the Rahorek and either Yasuo or Malphite, ideally both, you can actually, if your opponent's playing kind of like a slower deck, you can have some surprisingly scary turns. Your Yasuo will be leveling very fast in this deck with this concentration of stuns, as well as, you know, sometimes you'll get Crescent off of like Spacey Sketcher. And when you play Eye of the Rahorek and your Yasuo will always finish its level off of these 4 stuns that this landmark provides. And in addition to that, it'll start actually slashing for 5 damage once it's leveled, so it'll start really cleaning up this board. And of course, Eye of the Rohork counts for 10 landmark mana for Malphite, which means you only need 2 more if you've drawn 1 eye, which you'll get either in the form of Star-Tipped Peak or this one of Blue Sentinel. So basically, think it's a slow down Targon deck. You just want to like grind out the game, stall your opponent out with Lifesteal, with Fangs, with Solari Sunhawk stun, your own native stuns, star shaping and stuff like that, until you have a leveled Yasuo or a leveled Malphite that you can seek to close the game out with. One of Syncopation is kind of cute as just kind of like an alternate trick to be able to help protect some of these tools. And of course, you know, we've got Chip. Chip is here for moral support, right? He kind of like ties the whole party together. It's a very, very important component of this deck. All right, that's it. Those are my 10 decks for the Guardians of the Ancient expansion. I've got to go to bed now because I've been deck building for literally 8.5 hours straight, and it's past midnight. All right, so yeah, at the time that you're watching this, however, if you are watching this video sometime shortly after it got released on YouTube, I'm probably live right now on my Twitch channel, messing around with some of these decks or maybe some new concepts as well. So feel free to stop by and hang out, ask about what kind of deck we're playing, and yeah, that's it. Hope to see you guys there.